So denial service is basically the attack against availability, right? So availability actually can be associated with different resources, right? You can have CPU, you can have memory, you can have network, bandwidth, and so on. So denial service traditionally, many of the attacks are against bandwidth. For example, if you have a web server, if you have a lot of connections, then you have the connections will consume all the bandwidth. Just like the traffic jam. If you have a traffic jam, then the normal packet actually cannot go through. So in this case, the server is either down or very is not responsive. Then in this case, the normal user cannot access the service. Right. So this is basically what denial service attack performs. But bandwidth is just one resource that can be used by the attacker. And we can have different types of resources. For example, the CPU, right? So if you send some a malicious packet that will consume, or you let the server run some code with vulnerability, the server will basically consume all the CPU. That means your system will hang because the CPU is fully occupied by this malicious code or vulnerable code. So in this case, so maybe you give some special input which cause the program to enter infinite loop, right? So suppose you have you identify a vulnerability in the program. You know if you give a specific input, it will go to an infinite loop. In this case, then basically the CPU will keep on running this infinite loop. Then this is another type of denial service attack. Of course, you need to know how to generate inputs that will make the program enter this infinite loop. So CPU can be another target. Memory actually can be another target. So later we will see, for example, the so-called SYN spoofing or SYN flooding. These kind of attacks, they are from the network. They are against the TCP/IP. But actually, they are the attacks against the memory. Because every time the server accepts a connection request, it will allocate some buffer, some memory. So if we have this kind of flooding attack, then basically the server will use up all the memory. So then there is no space available for new connections. So the attacks from network, traditionally many attacks are against bandwidth. That means the network resource. However, there are other attacks coming from network, but their target is either like the CPU. For example, you give some malicious input to consume the CPU, or you can consume a lot of memory. So these are all the attacks that can happen in denial service attack. So as I said, bandwidth consumption is the traditional target for the denial service attack because each network has a bandwidth. For example, the very old a modem, right? So when I studied actually my bachelor, so modem is still very common. So the modem actually the speed is very low. It's only 56 kilobits per second. So compared with nowadays the internet speed actually is very low. And then you may also have a Wi-Fi network. Actually, depending on which standard you are using, you may have different bandwidth. Some have maybe about 100 megabits, some may have more, right? So each network has a bandwidth. That means upper bound. Again, the upper bound of the volume. So if you have a lot of traffic, essentially it's like a traffic jam. So the network is blocked by the traffic jam. Then other packet cannot go through. So this is bandwidth consumption for the denial service attack. Right, so one way to do this kind of bandwidth consumption is that you can use so-called broadcast address. So the idea is like this. So in each network, actually we have a broadcast address. The broadcast address means that if you send a packet to this address, then all the machines will receive this packet. Right, so that's a particular address used for broadcasting. Right, so in this case, actually we can use this network as some intermediary to launch the attack. Right, so we can, for example, combine this network address, this mechanism together with this echo request. So echo request is basically the ping request, right? If you want to test whether the machine is online or not, you can just ping this machine, right? So if you ping the machine, if it's alive, it will send you a response. Basically, you send a request, it will give you a response. So now if we combine this echo request together with the broadcast address, then we can create a denial service attack, right? So basically, you can send a request to a group of to the broadcast address of the network. Then all the machines basically will respond because you are sending a ping request to the broadcast address. Then all the machines in the network will respond. However, so if you don't do anything, you just do such kind of ping for broadcast, then all the traffic will come to your own machine, right? So then your own machine becomes the victim. So in this case, we need to combine another technique, which is called IP spoofing. You generate the IP packet. The sender address is the victim's address, not your own address. Receiver address is the broadcast address. You send this ping request to the network. Then all the machine now will send a response to the victim instead of your own machine. In this case, then you basically create a flag to the victim machine. So in this case, you can have a denial service attack against the bandwidth of the victim machine. So ICMP basically this is attack for the use based on the IP broadcasting address. And then another attack, which is a FRAGO attack, which is a similar attack, but it uses a UDP echo request, right? So there can be other resources. So the previous example is just a simple example to illustrate how a denial service attack can be done against a particular resource. But there are some other resources that can be targeted. For example, so as I said, sync flag. Although this is again an attack against the TCP protocol. So in the previous case, we used the IP broadcasting or UDP echo request to do the attack, and those are attacks against the bandwidth. Right? Here, sync flooding is also based on some issue in the TCP protocol. TCP will have a handshake, right? So we will see the details probably tomorrow. So you have a handshake, and then because of this handshake, actually the attacker can also create a denial service attack. But although the attack is against the network protocol, TCP protocol, but the resource actually is not the bandwidth. The resource attack is the memory, the buffer of the target. So we basically, every time you establish a TCP connection, you need to reserve some memory. So if you can create a flood to the target, then the target will use up all the memory. So in this case, it's a denial service attack against the memory. Right, so, and there are two different types of consequences caused by denial service attack. So the previous examples, essentially, we generate a lot of requests or traffic to flood the machine, right? So the machine becomes very slow. And another type of attack is to simply crash the machine. This will rely on some expertise on the underlying protocol. For example, if you can exploit some vulnerability inside protocol, then you can create some malicious packet. You may not need to have a lot of traffic. You only need to prepare a small poison like a packet. So this packet actually, when it is sent to the receiver will crash. The system will crash. So in this case, if you can exploit the vulnerability, you don't need to have a lot of requests or traffic. You only need a small packet to crash the system. So so this kind of packet are called the poison packet. So it will just crash the whole machine. And one typical example is this ping of DoS. So to crash the system. So this is basically the so-called quality attack. So you craft, you prepare a special packet to crash the system. And on the other hand, we can also, of course, have the quantity attack. Quantity attack means you can use a lot of requests or the broadcast address and so on flood victim. In this case, so you may not need to identify any security issues in the protocol. You just create a lot of traffic or a lot of requests to the victim in order to basically launch the attack. Okay, so maybe I just stop here because ping of death, I will need to explain some details about how TCP/IP works. So if you study 368, you should know TCP/IP. But if you haven't, then I will explain what TCP/IP is, and then why this ping of death can happen because of some issues in the TCP/IP protocol. Okay, so denied service is one of the major attacks performed through the network. So people can basically launch denied service attack to crash a server or to bring down a database or even a user a normal user computer. You can use denied service attack to basically crash the system. So we have looked at some general definition. So denied service is a attack against availability, right? So you can. So because the computer system usually require different types of resources, like network, memory, CPU, and so on. So the denial service attack can be launched against any of those resources. So if there is any fault or anything wrong in one of those resources, then the system can crash. In this case, normal users can no longer access the service, right? So there are also two different types of attacks. One is the brute force type attack. So you can use maybe broadcast address, or you can use some so-called amplifier. Later we will see some amplification technique used by the attacker. So you can amplify the attack so that you generate a lot of traffic or a lot of packets that will flood the machine. So in this case, the attacker basically uses a large volume of packets or traffic to overwhelm the victim. On the other hand, sometimes actually we could exploit the vulnerability or the bugs in the software or in the protocol. So for example, in the network communication, we have IP protocol, internet protocol, TCP protocol, right? So we have different types of protocol. If you can exploit some problems or flaws in those protocols, then you can also launch the denial of service attack. And so if there is some vulnerability, then you don't need to use a lot of resource in order to successfully perform the attack. So you may only need to prepare maybe some special packet, the poison packet. And the poison packet actually will exploit the vulnerability of the system. Then the system will crash. Even you just give maybe one packet or a few packets, then you can successfully launch the denial of service attack. So we will look at some typical examples of denial of service attack. Some of those attacks are very old attacks, like the ping of death. We will first look at this attack. So this attack was about 20 years ago. So 20 years ago, actually, people discovered this ping of death, right? So this is an attack against this, based on the ICMP protocol, right? So this protocol is also used in the Smurf attack, if you still remember. So the Smurf attack used this ICMP echo request together with the broadcast address to perform this denial of service attack. However, so for ping of death, so this time actually we don't generate a lot of packets. We just use some special packet to crash the system, right? So how does this? So this is basically a typical ping command. So you can ignore the length here. So you can specify the length of the packet, or you can ignore it. If you ignore it, then it will use a default size. Default size is quite small, just a few bytes. But if you want to test the connection, using a large packet, you can also specify the packet here. Okay, so however, there is a upper bound on the size of the packet because each IP packet there is a limitation. So you have a upper bound on the size of the packet. Right. So it looks
this ping command is very simple. So you just send a request, then if the server or the machine is alive, is online, then the machine will give you a response, and then you can test what's the time. For example, it may take like a few milliseconds for you to send a request and receive the response. So it will measure the round trip time, how long it takes to send the ping and receive the request, the response. So this is very simple utility. However, so people discover actually this utility can be used to crash a server, so crash a machine. So the problem actually is associated with the structure of the TCP/IP and the requirement from each individual layer. So in TCP/IP, actually we have different layers, 5 layers. So you have the application layer. So user only communicate with application layer. For example, your email client, your web browser, these are application layer software. So you communicate only with the application. Then the application layer will prepare the payload. For example, the data you entered in a form, then this is basically the payload of the application. And then the application may add a header, right? For example, the email will add the email header. Email header will contain sender address, receiver address, and so on. And then this packet, this is like a prepared packet at the application layer, will be forwarded to the next layer, which is TCP layer. So TCP layer, basically, it will add a new header in front. So maybe I can give you some idea. So if you study 368, probably you should already know the TCP/IP, because we study different standard at different layers. Okay, so if you look at if we look at the TCP/IP, basically we have so this is basically, first you have the application data. So this is your real data. So this is from the application. What the data like you generate, for example, you generate the email, right? So the application basically will add a header. So this header is you can say this is a header 1. Right, so this is application layer, application. So for example, your browser or email client will add a header, for example, to specify what's your email address and what's the receiver email address and so on. And then this data actually will be passed to the next layer. So next layer now will add another header, which is header 2. So this is for example, the transport layer. For example, it can be the TCP. If you use the TCP protocol or UDP protocol, then basically you will have this header. So the header includes, for example, the port address, right? So, for example, the web server use port 80, Secure Shell use port 22, and so on. So this is the second header. And then, so basically the data from the first layer will be treated as a payload here now. And then you continue this process. This now will be passed to the next layer, which is the IP layer, right? So now IP layer, you have another header. This is the IP layer. IP layer, the header of course contains the IP address and so on. Right, so this process will continue until you finish all the layers. Eventually you will send the packets through the so-called physical layer. Alright, so this is how TCP/IP works. Then the receiver, so basically the sender will process data from top to bottom. You interact with the application, then you prepare the data packet from top to bottom, right? And then the receiver actually will process data from bottom to top, because the receiver will first receive data from the so-called physical layer. Physical layer is where you use the channel to physically deliver the message. For example, you can use optical signal or electric signal to deliver the message. Right. So in this case, so the receiver will process data from bottom layer until the top layer. Right. So that means every time you just peel off one layer, so you first process at the bottom layer, you peel off the first layer, and then you get the packet for the second layer, like the data link layer. Then you peel off the layer again, you get data for the IP layer. So you do this process until you finish all the process as the application layer. So this is how TCP/IP works. Alright, so this protocol itself does not have any problem. However, the problem is for different layers, actually the limitation, the size of the packet is different. For the IP layer, so when we prepare IP packet, the size, the limit of the IP packet is this number, 65,000 plus, right? However, so this size actually is larger than the limitation of the next layer, which is data link layer. So when the IP packet is prepared and passed to the next layer, actually the data link layer cannot handle such big packet. So in this case, the fragmentation will be performed. So the original IP packet will be fragmented into different blocks, and then the blocks will be sent to the physical layer and delivered one by one. All right. So in this case, actually we don't deliver the whole IP packet. If the IP packet is small, you can just put it in one packet, then you deliver it. But if it's very large, then it will, if it exceeds the size of the data link layer, you need to do fragmentation. You send the blocks one by one. Okay, so the problem is here, if say some malicious attacker, they try to send a lot of small packet as a data link layer, but later when the receiver try to reassemble the IP packet, then actually there is a possibility the reassembled packet is bigger than the limitation. So in this case, if it's bigger than the limitation, then we will have a so-called buffer overflow. So buffer overflow basically is the topic we will study after denial service attack. So if a buffer overflow happens, that means some data in the buffer or the memory of the machine is overwritten by some other data. Then, depending on whether the data is critical or not, if the data is critical, then essentially the system will crash. Right? So here are some details about the size of the the mismatch of the size between the sender and the receiver. So here basically for the data link layer, we don't have a big the upper bound for the size of the packet is not as big as in the IP layer. So actually it's only about 1500 bytes. But the IP packet we can have 65,000 plus bytes. So in this case, the fragmentation will be performed. If you have a large IP packet, it will be fragmented into small ones, and then the small ones will be sent one by one. And then, of course, if you send the small packet one by one, you need to give an offset, because later the receiver needs to reassemble the small packet into the original packet. You need to tell the receiver which fragment is the first, which one is second, which one is third, right? So this is what you need to do. So basically, in the IP header, there is one field which will tell the receiver. Right, so in IP header, there is, besides IP addresses, there is also some other flags and fields. So one of the fields actually is to indicate for this packet, which, what's the position in the original IP packet. Because now you send the small packet one by one. So you need to tell the receiver, so which position this small packet should be put in the large IP packet. Right, so the offset actually is represented using 30-bit field. So the 30-bit field actually will represent the offset. And each one bit will represent 8 bytes. So if you look at this number, you can easily calculate. Actually, the maximum offset is this value. That means you can basically prepare the small packet with 15,000 each, about 1,500 bytes each. Then, so if you prepare the packet, so using the offset this value, this 30-bit field to represent the offset, then the maximum offset is this one. That means the last packet, small packet, the last packet delivered can start with this offset, right? So the last packet actually can have this. That means that all the previous small packet will, if you sum up the size, it can go up to this size. And then the last packet will start from this position. You know, so the one packet actually can have 1500, right? Each like a fragment can have 1500. So if say the last fragment start with this offset, it has a value like 1500 or even like a few hundred, then definitely the size is larger than the limitation. Because if you have this offset, that's the starting position of the last fragment, plus this value, definitely is bigger than the maximum value allowed for the IP packet. That means if you send a lot of small packets and the receiver now reassembles the small packet together, it is possible the overall size, the reassembled packet has a larger size as the limit. In this case, because the receiver only allocates this buffer, the maximum size for the packet. And now, if you reassemble all the small packet, you have a packet exceeding this limit, then that means there will be a buffer overflow. Some other content in the memory in the buffer will be overwritten by this big packet. So if the content overwritten is important, then basically the system will crash. So that's how this this pin of DoS actually can basically bring down a machine by just sending about 15 or 65,000 bytes. So in this case, actually, you can easily crash a server, for example, by preparing those packets that can. When the receiver reassemble those packets, then if buffer overflow occurs, then basically the system will crash. All right, so that's one typical example about the denial of service attack, which actually this attack exploits some problems or some flaws in the design of the network protocol. Right, so basically the problem actually can be addressed if say the server performs some exception handling. Right, so when when you write program, sometimes we need to consider what are the possible exceptions. For buffer overflow, the exception is the input to put in the buffer is larger than the buffer. So that's the exception. So if actually the server or the receiver or the protocol can perform some sort of exception handling or error handling, then this kind of attack actually can be avoided. But so nowadays this attack no longer works because there is the protocol has already been patched, so that you won't be able to launch this pin of DoS anymore. But maybe in the future people will exploit some other protocols which also have this kind of problem. Then you can still have buffer overflow, right? So we will look at this buffer overflow in the next topic anyway. So the previous example is just one typical example to illustrate how denial of service attack can work. So, and the previous one actually exploits some vulnerability or some flaws in the design of a scheme or system. And then there are some other attacks that can be performed against other resources. For example, so the previous attack actually is also an attack against the buffer, the memory, not the a network or the CPU. This one is an attack against CPU. Okay, so this again exploits some maybe issues in the software, for example, in the program. So if you write a very poor program, for example, you always use for loop. If you use a lot of for loop, then potentially your program can be a vulnerable software that can be attacked. Because if you don't handle, for example, some conditions carefully, or you simply use very simple functions with a lot of for loops, then this kind of program may consume a lot of CPU resource, right? So in this case, if someone tries to prepare some special input, so the special input may allow the program to enter an infinite loop, or may let this program perform a lot of expensive operations. So in this case, then basically we can have a denial service attack against CPU, right? So then you may ask, how does the attacker know there is a bug in the program? So in the previous case, the TCP/IP protocol is well documented. It's like a standard protocol, so people obviously they can find out. For my program, it's written by me, so people cannot see my source code. They can only see the exe file. How do they know there is bug inside? Actually, nowadays this kind of reverse engineering can be done very easily. So there are a lot of tools. They can decompile, like deassemble the code. So if you search on the internet, you can find some deassembler or decompiler. So basically, if given the machine code, they can convert it to the assembly code or even to the source code. So anyway, also based on the principle, there is one principle, right? So we know this is Kirchhoff's principle, and then it was later extended by someone else. So we should never rely the secret on the closed source. So we should not rely our security on the secrecy of the code. So that's something we need to avoid. So basically, we should assume the attacker anyway can find your source code, right? So even they only have the binary code, the executable file, they may still find some other way to locate the original source code. Okay, so let's look at one example. So if say the attacker can discover the source code by some method, for example, reverse engineering and so on, then how do we use how do we distinguish, for example, the vulnerable code from the good or secure code? So this example is a very simple example. Suppose we have a program. So if say that this program, the task is very simple, the function is very simple. It will remove the extra slash from the input. So if you have multiple slash, then it will just remove all of them, and then you have this one left, the last one left. So this is one simple program. However, so in this case, if you only have two, then there is no big issue. But what happens if there are many? So the different source code can have different behavior, and some of them may become vulnerable, right? So this is one example. So one example to perform this function. So basically, if there are multiple backslash, we just try to remove all of them, and we just keep one. So how to do that? Basically, you just scan the whole string. If you find there is a repeating backslash, you use a string copy to copy the next substring to the previous position. You move the substring one position in front, right? So one position backward. So in this case, every time you test if there is a double backslash, you remove the substring, the remaining substring, one position backward. That means that you remove, essentially you remove one backslash. So this is one way, one simple program, right? However, so there are some other ways you can do it. For example, this program actually will do the same job, but it will not do the string copy every time. So it will, if it identifies multiple backslash, it will just continue without doing anything until it reaches the last backslash. Then you copy the last substring to the first position where this backslash appears. Right. So this is a program that will perform the same job, and another program, a similar program, which can also do the same job. So we have three pieces of programs. However, so if you run the program, so you will discover the difference. So if you have if you look at the number of a backslash you give, if it's small, the number is small, this program behave similarly. So the time is actually negligible, basically. However, so if you have very large number of backslash, then the time becomes very significant. There is a very significant difference between the three programs on the running time, right? So in particular, the first one, you can see the time actually is very, here the time is very long. So it's about 1500 seconds right? So that's actually a long time. But for the other two programs, the time actually is still very small. So in this example, basically we illustrate that if you use although some programs, they can perform the same job, but depending on how you implement the program, right? So some of them actually can become vulnerable if the attacker gives some special input. On the other hand, if you have some good programming, like some good programs, some like robust programs, then even the attacker try some malicious input, the program will still behave like in a secure manner, right? So that's another example to illustrate how to attack the CPU, not like memory or the bandwidth. Okay, so in the previous case, actually, we also exploit some vulnerability. For example, if you use a first program, we exploit some vulnerability. Here is not we cannot say it's a bug, but it's some sort of vulnerability, some sort of weakness in the program. All right. So the next example we will look at is another example, which is a typical and also well-known denial service attack, which is so-called TCP SYN flooding. Okay. So this is also an attack against one of the network protocols, the TCP protocol. Right. So in the transport layer, we have two types of protocols. One is TCP, one is UDP. Right. So two common protocols used for the transport layer. So TCP actually is a reliable connection because you will do a 3-move handshake to establish the connection. That means when you want to have a connection established, a TCP connection established, basically the two devices or the two users, they need to do a handshake, right? So they need to make sure the other user is actually alive. But UDP does not perform such kind of handshake. So for UDP, you just prepare a packet, you add a UDP header, then you just send the packet, so the sender does not care. And the sender does not know whether the packet will be received or not. So that's different. So TCP, you will do a handshake before you deliver the real packet. So the handshake is done in 3 moves. So the client will send to the server a request with a so-called SYN request, and then the server will send to the client an acknowledgement. The acknowledgement is for the first SYN request, and then the server will also send another SYN request. Then the client need to send the last acknowledgement. So the last acknowledgement is for the SYN request from the server. So the client sent to the server a SYN request, server send a response, and the server at the same time also send a SYN request. Client will send the last acknowledgement. So the process is like this, right? So the SYN request will have a sequence number X, then the acknowledgement will be simply X plus 1. And the request from the server will be Y. And then the client will send Y plus 1 as the final acknowledgement. So this is a 3-move handshake. Right, so the problem here is whenever the server receives a request and send a second response, second message, server will need to allocate some memory, right? So allocate some buffer, right? So the server will need to allocate some buffer when it receives the request and when the server sends the second message. However, so suppose you don't have the server does not receive the last acknowledgement, then basically you have a half-open connection, right? So the server allocated some buffer and waiting for the acknowledgement. However, so suppose the acknowledgement never comes, then the server may need to resend the second one because second message, because maybe there is some problem in the network and the second message or third message is lost. So in this case, actually the server will resend the second message and wait for the third one. So the server will try several times. Then if eventually, say after a time limit is arrived, so eventually, say after server attempt several times, but the client still didn't send the last acknowledgement, then the server will terminate this connection. However, so during this time period, the server allocates a buffer and waiting for the response. So in this case, if there are a lot of requests sent to the server, then the server basically will have a lot of half-open connections. And each half-open connection will occupy some buffer, some memory. So if the whole, like a table, the buffer is occupied, then the server cannot handle any new request because the buffer is full. So if the buffer is full, then you cannot handle any new request. So in this case, any new connection request will be rejected by the server. So in this case, we have a so-called denial of service attack. Right, so how to perform this attack? So actually, the attack is not the idea, rough idea is like that, but you still need to use some technique to launch this attack, right? So one typical technique that will be used by the attacker is IP spoofing. Again, using IP spoofing, right? So how to use IP spoofing? Why we use IP spoofing? Because if you use your own machine to generate a lot of half-open requests, half-open connection, then the server obviously will know there are so many requests and then all are half-open, then the server know the attacker is this sender, the initiator of the request, right? So in this case, actually, the attacker will use IP spoofing to use some other IP address, and then so the attacker actually can simply use some random IP address. So for the attacker, so the good part of using random IP address is maybe the IP address does not exist. So in this case, if the IP address does not exist, so you use a non-existing IP address to send the request, server will send the second message to this non-existing machine. Then the server will never get the response. So server will resend the second message and wait for the response, but there is no response because such a machine does not exist. So this is the good part of using a random IP address. And also, if you use random IP address, the server will not know, will not be able to detect whether this is an attack or not, because all the requests are from different IP addresses. So the server will not know whether this is a real request or fake request. So in this case, actually, the attacker can use IP spoofing to confuse the server, right? So you just prepare a packet using some random IP address, and you send to the server. Server send a second message. However, so because this IP address may not exist, then the server will never receive any response. And then you keep on doing this using different random IP address. The server basically will have a lot of half-open connections. So in this case, the server will have this denial service attack. So we can basically occupy the buffer of the server, and the server cannot take any new request. So in this case, we will successfully launch a denial service attack against the server. So that's how this SYN flooding works, right? So it's attack against the buffer, the memory of the server. Okay, so how to prevent this kind of SYN flooding? So this kind of attack actually can happen not just in TCP protocol, in other protocol as well. So if you do, for example, if any protocol require handshake, right? So in particular, some security protocols, they also need a handshake, right? So for example, if you remember, like the IPsec, sorry, some of you may not have started the 368 yet. So in some security protocols, you also need to perform a handshake before you do the real protocol. So in this case, all this kind of attack, attack can happen in those protocols. And then, there are some countermeasures that can be used to resist such kind of attack. And the countermeasure actually is used also in different protocols. Right. So there are some simple mechanisms, trivial mechanisms. For example, you can have this timeout. Right. So you can reduce the waiting time, the time window. For example, instead of waiting for half second, I just wait for maybe maybe 10 milliseconds is too short, maybe 100 milliseconds or something like that, right? And then the random dropping is another method. So if the buffer is full, you randomly drop some half-open connections. This is another approach. And there are some advanced approaches. So one is the so-called client puzzle. So this is the topic we will study next. So this is also a solution based on the concept of so-called proof of work. So it's related to like Bitcoin and blockchain and so on. So I will also briefly mention how proof of work works, how this concept can be applied in like blockchain and so on. And then another mechanism actually used, and this mechanism actually is implemented in different protocols. So this is called a sync cookie. So the sync cookie basically allows the server to establish connection without reserving the buffer in the memory. Right? So this is a good feature of this protocol. So essentially, the problem of the sync flooding is the server need to reserve some memory for all the half-open connections, and the sync cookie basically eliminate the requirement to reserve some buffer. So the idea is actually like this, because if you look at the protocol here, the TCP protocol here, the server will also need to send a sequence number, right? So basically, the server now in the sync cookie, after receiving the request, server does not reserve any content in the buffer. Server will send a value, a special Y. So this Y is called a cookie. So the Y actually contains the content that allows the server to reconstruct the information in the buffer. So now Y actually is a specially like designed sequence number. So we call this the sync cookie, the cookie. So this cookie actually is designed by the Y, so that by the server, so that later, when the server receives the correct Y, the server can reconstruct the entry in the buffer. So in this case, the server just send Y to the network, and then server don't need to store anything. So when the client sends the last acknowledgement, because acknowledgement is always Y plus 1, so server can derive Y from Y plus 1, and then server can reconstruct the entry in the buffer. That means you can reconstruct everything after you receive the third response. But before you receive the third response, you don't store anything in the buffer. Essentially, you store the content in the Y, and then the Y actually is passed through the network. So this is a mechanism to use to prevent this kind of sync flooding. And of course, the one problem here is how does the server know this Y is correct? Right? So the server will need to find a way to verify this is the correct Y I sent to the client earlier. So how to do that? Actually, you can attach some checksum in the Y. So the checksum can only be computed and verified by the server. Server prepare Y and then add some checksum in the Y. And later, when the server receives this acknowledgement, server will recover the original Y and verify. If this Y is correct, then the server will continue the connection. Otherwise, the server will simply reject the connection. So this is basically how the sync cookie works. And in some of you may have studied 368 already. So for example, in the IKE, Internet Key Exchange, if you still remember, we also have a so-called cookie exchange. Right? So the cookie is similar as a sync cookie here. So in the IKE Internet Key Exchange protocol, before we do the real key exchange, the handshake, we also do a cookie exchange. So the cookie exchange is essentially performing the same task. Because if you do not do such kind of cookie exchange, or if you don't use this kind of sync cookie, then basically you need to reserve the buffer during the handshake. And this can be a potential point for the denial service attack. So that's why in IKE, actually, we also do a sync cookie, cookie exchange. So the idea is essentially the same as the sync cookie used here to prevent the TCP sync flood. So you can apply the same mechanism in other protocols when you have a similar situation. Okay, so this is basically the sync cookie approach used to prevent the sync flooding attack, and also some other similar attack. Right, so in the previous cases, we looked at some denial of service attack, some simple cases. And the more dangerous or nowadays actually the denial of service attack is no longer like launched by a single machine. So nowadays actually we can use like so-called distributed denial of service attack to overwhelm the victim. Alright, so this can be done in different ways. Right, so one way actually is to use a broadcast address. That's some like a technique we have already looked at, like in the Smurf attack or the Fraggle attack. And on the other hand, actually we can also use the so-called botnet. So the botnet is a network of machines compromised by the attacker. So in this case, all these machines we call them zombie machines. So this is actually the zombie is one of the malware. So that can infect the machine, and then basically the machine becomes a helper of the attacker to launch the distributed denial of service attack. So usually the attacker can just control a botnet, and then the botnet will help the attacker to launch the distributed denial of service attack. Alright, so this kind of attack sometimes is difficult to defend against. Alright, so because nowadays, if you can control, because the world is interconnected, you can have like zombie machines infected in different locations. So in this case, you cannot say prevent this kind of attack by simply using the firewall to blocking traffic from particular addresses. Because if the zombie machines are allocated at different locations, the firewall cannot really block the packets. For example, if you have public web server, so public web server should be accessible by all the users, but maybe you can you can use a firewall to block particular traffic. And if the traffic, attackers are all around the world, then you cannot really do the blocking for this kind of attacks. And here are some data you can look at. So basically the volume of data used by the attacker actually in the distributed denial of service attack actually increased a lot in the recent years. So these are some old numbers, and I think in recent years, if you go to this semantic like a security report, so if you look at the reading materials, the semantic actually produce annual security report. So nowadays, actually the volume of the data used by the attacker can be at the level of a terabyte. So if you have a lot of machines launching this distributed denial of service attack, then the volume can be at the level of a terabyte. So this is huge, right? So you can look at some reports in the reading materials, right? So the distributed denial of service attack actually can be used to overwhelm any public service, servers. For example, like HTTP server. So in this case, if you have a lot of requests, a lot of zombie machines sending requests to the HTTP server, then this will make the server very slow, or makes the server irresponsive, not responsive. Okay. However, so it's also difficult to prevent this kind of attack, as I mentioned. So you cannot block. For example, if this is a public web server, you have a company, you have a public web server. So usually you don't want to block requests. At least you don't want to block all the requests from different addresses. So in this case, it's difficult to prevent. All right. So in this kind of attack, actually the attacker is more advantageous than the victim, right? So attacker can even use some other resources on the network to perform the amplification, to perform the reflection attack or amplification attack, right? So in this case, so those machines may not be infected. So in the previous distributed denial of service attack, we look at some zombie machine infected by the malware. In this case, the zombie machine will help the attacker, but sometimes the attacker may even not need to infect those machines. So the attacker may simply use some clean machines on the network to perform the attack, right? So one typical example is the reflection attack, and this attack actually is using this innocent machine on the network as a reflector. right? So it will reflect. Basically, the attacker will send some message to this reflector. The reflector will reflect the packet to the victim. And sometimes we can also use the reflector to amplify the attack, because in some server, for example, the DNS server, the domain name server, you send a small request, it will generate a large response. So in this case, actually, the attacker only need to send a small packet. The response sent to the attacker, to the victim, will be a large, very large packet. Right. So this is a typical example, typical scenario of a reflection attack. Right. So you basically the attacker in this case can send a request to the reflector, and the reflector basically will send a response to the target. And sometimes the response can be much larger than the request sent by the attacker. Right. So this picture looks similar as the SYN spoofing or SYN flooding attack. Right. So the attacker sends something, the server sends to another machine. However, so in this case, actually, in the previous SYN flooding attack, the victim actually is the server, because we want to consume the memory of the server. But in this reflection attack, actually the victim is this final target. So this server now becomes a reflector, some like an intermediary machine that will be used by the attacker. So in this case, the attacker does not need to even infect this machine. So this is not a zombie machine. It's a clean machine, but it will be used by the attacker to attack this target. Okay, so in some situations, you may also even include create a loop between the server and the victim, right? So this picture illustrates this scenario. So in this case, actually, the attacker sent a UDP echo request to the server, the DNS server, right? So the attacker sent a packet to the DNS server using the IP spoofing. So again, the attacker will use the victim's IP address as the sender address. So we will still use the IP spoofing in this attack. So in this case, the attacker sent this packet to the DNS server. DNS server will send basically the response to the victim. However, so in this case, actually, the attacker sent a specific port number here, right? So port number 7. And this port number 7 actually is the UDP like an echo request. So in this case, basically you send a request to the DNS server at port 53, then DNS server will send a response to this victim. But this is a packet sent to port 7. Port 7 is a UDP echo request. Then this machine will again send an echo back. So the server send this message, the victim will echo back to the server, and the server then may send a response again. So in this case, you may even create a loop between the server and the victim. Right. So this is another scenario that can happen in the reflection attack. Right. So in general, the attacker in denial of service attack, in particular distributed denial of service attack, the attacker can use combine all these techniques to amplify the attack. So the attacker itself may not need to use a lot of resource. However, the created volume against the target can be huge. For example, the attacker can control a set of zombie machines, and each zombie machine can send a packet to the reflectors. Reflectors then will send the response to the target. So in this case, actually, you can create a huge volume against the target. And on the other hand, actually, the attacker may not need a lot of resource to launch such an attack. So this is how the reflection can work. So here, basically, the reflector may be some specific services, like a DNS service or some other servers. So they will basically take a small request but generate a large response. So in this case, for example, for DNS server, so you only need a 60-byte request, but the response generated by the server actually is much larger. And then if you use some game server, it's even bigger. So if you send a 2K request, it will generate a 500K response. So it also basically amplifies the attack, because for the attacker, the request only require a small packet, but the response for the victim actually will generate a large volume of data. Right, so for the prevention, so basically how to prevent, of course we can use like access control. Basically, so for example, the firewall can control, for example, what kind of packet can go through. For example, in the Smurf attack, one typical way to prevent the Smurf attack, if you check, so if this is like a ping request, but the receiver is a broadcast address, then the firewall can simply kill this packet. The firewall just drop this packet. So a firewall, we will study firewall later. So it's placed at the entrance of the network. Say if you receive a ping packet, but the destination is a broadcast address, then the firewall can simply just drop this packet. So in this case, we actually try to use access control to prevent the attack. Capture can also be used, because if you use capture, then say if you want to like prevent some attacker using a machine to like perform this denial of service attack, you can simply send a challenge. The capture is a challenge. So if it's a zombie machine or if it's a reflector, they will not solve the challenge in the capture, because these are the like zombie machine or the reflectors. These are machines. They cannot solve the capture. So if the request is real from the human, then they can solve the capture and generate the response, the correct response. So in this case, we can prevent zombie machines of reflectors by using capture. So we only accept requests from the real human, not the like machines. Okay. So we can also use the intrusion detection and the prevention protocol, isolation protocol. So we will look at this one later in intrusion detection. So there are some other like scanners available. So you can use this scanner to scan whether there is any potential vulnerability for the attacker to do this denial service attack. Right. So and also you can go to some website. So this is one of the websites. They sell the product for preventing denial service attack. But they also provide a lot of information about, for example, the knowledge and the current state of technology, state-of-the-art technology for preventing the intrusion, the denial service attack. So you can go to the website and see some information.